What if the four most influential books in human history were not originally signed by the names we associate with them today? What if the titles The Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not part of the earliest versions of the texts? And what if understanding how these writings emerged changes the way we see the entire foundation of Christianity? Today, we are exploring one of the most important historical questions in biblical studies: who actually wrote the Gospels? Before jumping to conclusions, stay with me to the end. The evidence is more nuanced than skeptics claim, but also more complex than many believers assume. Let's begin with a fact that surprises many modern readers. The four Gospels do not explicitly identify their authors within the body of the text. You won't find a sentence that says, "I, Matthew, wrote this account," or "I, John, record these events." The names attached to these writings appear in later manuscript headings. This immediately raises a crucial question. If the original documents were technically anonymous, how do we know who wrote them? To answer that, we need to step back into the 1st century. Jesus was crucified around the year 30 AD, for several decades after his death. His followers spread his teachings primarily through oral proclamation. The ancient Mediterranean world relied heavily on memorization and oral transmission. Rabbis trained disciples to retain teachings accurately. Important speeches and traditions were preserved carefully within communities. The message about Jesus was preached long before it was written down. Scholars widely agree that the Gospel of Mark was likely the earliest to be composed, around 65 to 70 AD. Matthew and Luke probably followed between 70 and 85 AD, and John is usually dated between 90 and 100 AD. That means the Gospels were written roughly 30 to 70 years after Jesus' crucifixion. For modern readers, that might sound like a long gap, but in the context of ancient biography, it is relatively short. Many ancient historical figures were documented decades or even centuries after their lives. Yet historians still consider those sources valuable. Now, let's examine each Gospel individually. Tradition attributes the Gospel of Mark to John Mark, a companion of the Apostle Peter. Early Christian writers state that Mark recorded Peter's preaching. According to Papias, Mark served as Peter's interpreter and wrote down his recollections carefully, though not necessarily in strict chronological order. This testimony is significant because Papias lived relatively close to the apostolic generation. His writings reflect traditions circulating in the early 2nd centuries. If Mark's Gospel reflects Peter's eyewitness testimony, then its authority is indirectly apostolic. The Gospel of Matthew has traditionally been linked to the Apostle Matthew, also known as Levi, the tax collector called by Jesus. Early Christian sources suggest that Matthew wrote for a primarily Jewish audience, which would explain the frequent references to Old Testament prophecy. However, modern scholars often note that Matthew appears to use Mark as a literary source. This raises a question. If Matthew was an eyewitness, why would he rely on Mark's account? Some argue that even Certain eyewitnesses may organize their writing using existing structured narratives. Others see this as evidence that the Gospel of Matthew may have been composed within a Matthean community. The Gospel of Luke presents itself differently. Its opening verses explicitly describe a careful investigation. The author states that he has examined everything closely from the beginning. Luke does not claim to be an eyewitness. Instead, he positions himself as a historian, compiling testimony from those who were eyewitnesses. Tradition identifies Luke as a physician and companion of the Apostle Paul. The style of Greek in Luke and Acts is more refined, suggesting an educated author. The book of Acts, which continues Luke's narrative, strengthens the case for a single author behind both works. Finally, we come to the Gospel of John. Traditionally attributed to the Apostle John, the beloved disciple, this Gospel differs significantly in style and theology. It presents longer discourses and deeper theological reflection. Some scholars propose that the Gospel of John may have emerged from a Johannine community, this community shaped by the apostles' teachings rather than being personally written word for word by him. Here we encounter the tension between early church tradition and modern critical scholarship. The early Christian community consistently attributed the four Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We do not possess early competing traditions assigning these texts to entirely different figures. This consistency is important. If the early church had wanted to strengthen the authority of these writings artificially, it could have attributed all four to major apostles. Instead, two of the Gospels are attributed to figures who were not part of the 12, Mark and Luke. That detail suggests authenticity rather than invention. Now, let's consider manuscript evidence. The earliest fragments of the Gospels, such as Papyrus 52, demonstrate that these texts were circulating widely. When Gospel manuscripts include titles, those titles consistently identify the same authors. We do not find ancient manuscripts attributing Matthew's Gospel to Thomas or Luke's Gospel to Peter. This uniformity strengthens the historical case for traditional authorship, but we must also acknowledge literary analysis. Modern scholarship observes patterns of shared material among Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This has led to theories such as Markan priority. Even if that theory is correct, it does not eliminate apostolic involvement. It simply suggests a literary relationship. We must also understand something about ancient authorship conventions. In the ancient world, writing was often collaborative. A teacher might dictate teachings that a disciple recorded. A community might preserve and shape material. Attribution reflected authority and origin, not necessarily solitary composition in the modern sense. Therefore, the question, who wrote the Gospels, must be approached carefully. Are we asking who physically held the pen, or are we asking whose testimony stands behind the text? If Mark recorded Peter's preaching, and Luke compiled eyewitness testimony, and Matthew and John wrote within apostolic authority, then the Gospels are deeply rooted in the earliest Christian witness. The historical gap between Jesus' life and the written Gospels is not extraordinary by ancient standards. Moreover, early Christian communities had strong incentives to preserve the teachings accurately. Now we arrive at a crucial turning point. The debate over authorship is often framed as a battle between faith and skepticism. But the evidence does not support extreme conclusions on either side. There is no credible historical evidence that the Gospels were invented centuries later. At the same time, the texts themselves do not function as modern autobiographies signed in first person. We stand in a middle ground, early and consistent tradition, strong manuscript evidence, and literary features that reflect both eyewitness testimony and theological reflection. Perhaps the deeper question is not simply who wrote them, but are they trustworthy? Authorship matters because it relates to credibility. If the Gospels are connected to eyewitness testimony or close associates of eyewitnesses, their historical reliability gains strength. And here is something rarely emphasized. The early church accepted these four Gospels despite having access to other writings. The reason was not random selection. It was recognition of apostolic authority and widespread usage in early communities. The canon did not emerge overnight. It developed through discernment, usage, and theological reflection grounded in history. Now, consider this. If you were living in the first century and you encountered a written account of Jesus connected to Peter's preaching or to a disciple who walked with him, would you question whether the author personally signed every page? Or would you focus on whether the message reflected authentic apostolic teaching? The modern obsession with individual authorship sometimes overlooks ancient realities. And here lies the final perspective. Even if certain editorial processes were involved, even if communities helped preserve and organize teachings, that does not imply fabrication. It reflects transmission. The Gospels emerged from living communities rooted in eyewitness memory. They were not late legends disconnected from history. They were early testimonies shaped within a generation of the events they describe. So who wrote the Gospels? Historically speaking, the strongest evidence supports traditional attribution connected to apostolic authority or indirectly. But perhaps the more transformative question is this: do you approach the Gospels as ancient propaganda or as preserved testimony from those who believed they had encountered the risen Christ? If this exploration has helped you understand the historical foundations of the Gospels more clearly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we examine difficult questions with intellectual honesty and historical depth. Now, I want to hear your perspective. Do you find the early church tradition convincing, or do you lean more toward modern critical theories? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because understanding who wrote the Gospels is not just an academic exercise. It is a gateway to understanding how the most influential message in history was preserved. transmitted, and proclaimed. And sometimes, the deeper you investigate history, the more carefully you must rethink your assumptions.